let's just start first. Why don't you tell us just a little bit about the Holocaust and Humanity Center, which I know is part of the Museum Center in Cincinnati. But tell us just a little bit about that, because there's a couple of concepts that you I guess highlight in that museum that I think is relevant to this discussion.
Sure. So the Holocaust and Humanity Center here in Cincinnati was founded about 20 years ago by Holocaust survivors in this region, but similar to centers and museums around the country. It was done because survivors wanted to ensure that not only their stories and the history would be preserved, but the lessons of the Holocaust. And so the survivors in our community many years ago said, we want our stories to be a warning for the future. And so we've really taken that to heart in the new museum that just opened a month ago here in Cincinnati, and even reflects our name, the Holocaust and Humanity Center, which is both about certainly teaching what happened during the Holocaust and how it happened, how individuals made choices, and which ultimately led to the atrocities that we now know a lot about. But we're also committed to allowing the past to help us think about the lessons for today. And so we also have a humanity gallery, which focuses on instead of, looking back and saying, what would I have done or what could we have done, let's look forward and say, what can we do now? How can we be an upstander? How can we make a difference today on the issues that matter? Okay.
And so, with that said, and I want to get into, because we, some incredibly disturbing stories about just in the past week, about the rise of things like white nationalism and white supremacy and hate groups. And before we get into a couple of those stories, whether it's obviously this domestic terrorist that was caught, or reports from the Southern Poverty Law Center, this concept of upstanding versus bystanding. What is? Explain that to us.
Yeah. So, for so long, in particular in Holocaust education, I think other realms, we've talked about one of the lessons is don't be a bystander, that hate and injustice and so many horrible things happen because people are standing by, right? If we always think if more people would have stood up or spoken up or resisted in some way, that perhaps the outcome could be different. And so what we learned is people in the past actually did stand up. So there are remarkable stories of individuals not only who, which we certainly know about, hid Jews, but also resisted the Nazis in various ways. And so we're taking that concept. So that concept of upstanding, that, there are ways to make a difference and not be a bystander, whether that's speaking out, whether that's creating some response, that it takes different forms and ways. We're not all going to respond in the same way, but we all have the potential within us in our own unique ways. We all have, unique strengths and contributions we can make to the world, that we can make a difference. And so this idea that all of us have the responsibility to, as we learn from the Holocaust, to not stand by, to not be bystanders. So if we say don't be a bystander, what are we saying? What we're hoping we say is, instead, let's be upstanders. When we see hate speech, when we hear a joke, when we see horrific things happening, whether it's in our community, our country, our world, that we have a responsibility to stand up and to do something.
I mean, what are the factors that distinguish it? I mean, is it simply there were different people had, I guess, one degree or a greater degree of character, the moral character than others? Or I mean, are there contextual factors that make it more or less likely that a certain individual will intercede? I mean, we have examples just in the past 2 years of things like, the Muslim ban comes to mind, where all of a sudden, people mobilized immediately and went to airports defending people who they had no idea who they were. It was all, fundamentally based on what they saw was a step in the wrong direction for society?
So that's a great question, and something that many researchers, including psychologists and sociologists and others, have tried to examine, especially as it relates to the Holocaust. So what is it within, the individuals who stood up that made them do so? In many ways, it's actually been hard to identify. And there are some similarities. One, the people who were rescuers or who stood up often said, I saw the humanity in the other person. I saw myself in the other person. Or the other issue or situation, and I could imagine it being me. In many cases, people talk about role models. So there are people that shape them, whether from the time they were young or adults, to think about the choices they make and other human beings and our responsibility. There are some factors, but there's not true consensus. I think one of the things that we're focusing on in our exhibition, you mentioned character strengths. We're focusing on character strengths and this concept that all human beings have character strengths. There's actually character science about how it works, and psychologists who have studied this, and that it takes practice for us to actually use them. One of the things that we found as well is that individuals who do one small act are more likely to do more. So even historically, we saw, somebody who perhaps a Jewish, somebody who was being persecuted came to a non-Jew's house and said, "Could I spend the night?" And they said, "Oh, I'm really nervous, but yeah, I'll let you spend the night." And then it becomes a week, and then it grows. So same thing, I think even today, once you do a little bit, there's opportunity to actually practice being an upstander and learning how to use our character to the best of our ability.
That's fascinating, and I imagine on some level then the idea of having people engage and intercede, even in the smallest of situations, becomes like it's almost as if you're building some type of immunity that aggregates over time or grows on itself.
I think that's 100% right. And actually, I think the small moments in some ways are where it matters most, because that's where we're learning how to make a difference and how to be upstanders and modeling for others. And, there's so many examples. We actually have many stories in our Humanity Gallery of where individuals in a single moment have made a choice that's had an enormous ripple effect that, they never knew about. Things like, somebody working at our city incinerator and recognizing that there are items people are throwing out that other people could use and need. And so he starts collecting them and delivering them to the community. And it turns out to be our biggest really food pantry wraparound social service organization now in our community. So it's those small moments that matter.
All right, what's fascinating, all right, we've talked about sort of the, I guess, one side of the coin, which is the way that the implications of good people doing something small and good. And but when we come back, let's talk a little bit about some of the bad people. Hate to be this reductionist, but sure. When we talk about a potential domestic terrorist, and we talk about the increase of hate groups in this country, that's the flip side of that coin. We got to take a quick break. We'll be right back. I'm Sam Seder. This is Ring of Fire Radio. We will be right back in just one moment with Sarah Weiss.